thank you to the International Network for the invitation to present today. I'm really, really pleased to be here with Richard Stevens, who will appear shortly, to talk about the development of GRIP and also our international evidence base, which is really, really important. So I'm going to take you through, I guess, a bit of the history of GRIP, where it came from and why we developed it, some examples of how we've used it, and a little bit of thinking about the future and what we want to do with it. So I hope it's going to be interesting, and we're really looking forward to your thoughts and comments and your perspectives on GRIP too. Okay, so hopefully the technology will work. At the moment, oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so starting off with thinking about evidence first of all, and I'm sure everyone on the call is aware that certainly in health and social care, evidence and the concept of evidence and knowledge is really, really important. And by evidence, what I mean is the sort of peer-reviewed publications that we see in journals that have gone through some sort of peer review. And peer review is really important in evidence because it gives us some assurance of quality. It gives some assurance of someone has looked at the methods and the concepts and the way a study has interpreted and synthesized findings. Ideally, that evidence is co-produced with public contributors and partners, but not always. The sort of, I guess, the evidence and knowledge aspects of that are also really important in terms of different forms of knowledge. And some of that can come from policy reports, it can come from other sorts of papers and commentaries. So through that evidence, we can develop a real sense of an understanding of an area. And I think more broadly, when we talk about evidence, we're also talking about sometimes clinical evidence, sometimes economic evidence, and sometimes what we call patient-based evidence. So the public involvement part of shaping a broader health and social care evidence base is also really important. So it can be quite a complex picture of where public involvement appears in that evidence base, but it's vital that we have an understanding and a knowledge of it and can develop it. And the key reason why evidence is important is that it really helps us to develop our thinking about what works and why and for whom and in what way. And I think that's sort of quite a realist evaluation approach to thinking about it, but that does sit well with public involvement. So I could maybe search for papers about a particular approach in public involvement and try and understand whether it works, why it works and how. And that can be really, really important, I think, because it helps us to grow our practice. And it helps us to maybe not do some things that we know don't work or aren't helpful, and focus on perhaps doing the things that are useful and we know have an impact and we know have some sort of effectiveness in terms of impact on the research. And I guess the other part of this is this concept of tacit knowledge. So we have the formal, published, sometimes peer-reviewed evidence, but we also have tacit knowledge. And by that, I mean the knowledge of practitioners. So people who are experienced or not so experienced public involvement practitioners can be really critical and important in shaping what we do in public involvement. And that tacit knowledge, I think, can become a part of formal peer-reviewed knowledge. And the journal that we have, Research Involvement and Engagement, often has studies where people report on their practice, and that does add to the evidence. And these things tend to get blended together. So different forms of knowledge, evidence and learning come together and are really important for us to understand. So I guess you're probably thinking, from my perspective, evidence is as a key sort of foundation for public involvement. It can help shape what we do, and it can help us avoid the things that perhaps don't work so well. So what we've seen over the last probably 2 or 3 decades is this growing body of international literature, peer-reviewed papers and reports about public involvement, sometimes led by patient groups, sometimes published in journals, but it has grown exponentially. And I think particularly over the last decade, there's been enormous growth. And we've seen it in specialist journals. So we published a paper, for example, in the journal of one of the journals of surgery, where we did a systematic review of what public involvement in surgery looks like, and also in generic journals, so journals like Health Expectations and our journal, Research Involvement and Engagement. And that was specifically set up in 2015 when we felt prior to that there was a bit of a gap, and it was often quite difficult for people to publish their work. Some journals didn't always recognise it as legitimate in terms of evidence, and we felt that in order for the area to progress, we really needed to have a dedicated journal. And I think Richard can maybe pick up on this later, but we are still the only international journal dedicated to public involvement that has a co-production model. So myself and Richard are the two co-editors in chief, and we make our decisions together. And we work with patient peer reviewers and academic peer reviewers. So it's, in the world of publishing, it's quite an unusual model, but we always feel it sort of pushes at that, I guess, that boundary of what evidence looks like in formal published literature. So this international evidence base is really, really important for us, and it's one that we want to support. Now, the origins of GRIP2, having told you all about the evidence aspects of it, we undertook a couple of systematic reviews. Gosh, it was some time ago now, but this was the origin of GRIP2. So Joe Brett and Carol Mockford led two reviews. Joe's review was looking at public involvement in the context of health and social care research. Carol's was a sister review that looked at sort of health and social care provision. So we started out very optimistically. These were two great reviews. One was funded by the UK CRC, as it was then, and one was funded by the National Centre for Involvement, which was an NHS and research funded centre. So these two reviews started out really, really important. And as they progressed, it became increasingly obvious that it was very difficult to extract the information. So Carol and Joe had a really difficult job of finding information consistently in ways that meant they could remove it from the paper and put it into their data extraction. And they found things like a limited conceptualization of public involvement. So people didn't present it in ways where we could understand what they meant. Poor quality of methods reporting. So particularly that, we didn't really know what they'd done. So had they set up a group? Had they talked to people? Often that wasn't described. There was what we call unclear content validity of studies. So we didn't know whether they'd reported on all the aspects of public involvement that were important to that particular study. They didn't tell us much about the context in which they were working or the process, which we know are really important aspects of public involvement. And then we found enormous variability in the way impact was reported. Sometimes nothing was mentioned. Other times there was much more of a comprehensive account. So there was little real evaluation of the quality of the involvement either. Very little on negative impacts, which we're always interested in because they can be really important in helping shape our thinking about what not to do. So what has not worked well can be really vital. And then very little on measurement of impact. And I know this is a contested area, but it was something we were interested in and still are in terms of, can you measure it? How do you measure impact of involvement? And what could that look like? So you can imagine with these challenges, it was a bit like wading through treacle. And if we were to describe the evidence base, we would probably say it was more like letting 1,000 flowers bloom, which sounds lovely, but when you're trying to gather those flowers together and put them into organized areas, it makes it really challenging. And of course, that means that when you're trying to find a solution or answer a question in research, it becomes really difficult because the sort of synthesis of the evidence is problematical when it's so different. But I would sort of emphasize that poor reporting isn't unusual. It's not that public involvement is really badly reported and everything else is fine. This is really common in health research. And it meant that we felt slightly better about that, but also we knew that we needed to address it, because if we were to build this evidence base, we really needed to give some signals about what sorts of things should be reported for it to be useful. So when we went through these 2 reviews, and Joe and Carol did a fantastic job of getting them to the point of publication, as we met and as we discussed, it became apparent that there were gaps and that we really needed to try and support our community to address those gaps. And that's where the original GRIP checklist, which was published in 2011, emerged from. It emerged from this enormous process and frustration that the evidence synthesis was really, really quite challenging. So in terms of the evolution of GRIP 2, once the first GRIP had been published, we had lots of interest and people wanting to know how they could use it. And I think we realised that there was this interest in more consistent reporting of public involvement that would help us and help future syntheses of evidence. But we also recognised that it can't just be us making those decisions. We'd found gaps in the literature, but we really needed to test that out with our community. And so what we did was sort of partner up with Equator and with other organisations and other public contributors who were interested in becoming part of this journey. And I think our ambition really was to develop international consensus on the items to report. So that might include identifying items, but also testing it out with an international community. And Equator, and I'll say a bit more about Equator in a minute, but Equator has a very precise 18-step process, which includes a 3-stage Delphi. So that's a questionnaire effectively that goes out to people to indicate the extent to which they think an item should be included in GRIP. So that was a 3-stage process, and that went out to researchers, policymakers, patients and public contributors. And of course, we had public involvement in the development of GRIP too. But one of the things we found when we started, we had a long list of items, as you can imagine. The feedback from the Delphi at stage 1 indicated that people were interested not only in a long form of GRIP, where they might be doing a study particularly on public involvement, but they were interested in a short form version that could be used with any study design and would just move us along in terms of people reporting their public involvement if they had done it. So in round 2 and 3, we asked people to indicate which items should go into the short form version, which was really helpful for us. And it was great that people had raised that and had that active input. So here's an example of the Equator website, if you're not familiar with it. So Equator is all about enhancing the quality and transparency of health research. And you can see here that there's a whole range of different sorts of guidelines. So we have in the middle CONSORT for randomized trials, STROBE for observational studies, and PRISMA for systematic reviews, which is used a lot. And all of these guidelines include items that need to be reported consistently. And many of the journals now ask for these items, for these guidelines to be used when researchers report. And so over time, this is meaning that our evidence base more broadly in these areas is starting to become more consistent. So in fact, when I did the search for GRIP 2, it is in the longer list, because as you can see, there are 483 reporting guidelines, which is pretty significant in terms of trying to make the evidence base in health and social care research more consistent, which is pretty impressive in terms of the work Equator have done. And I guess the other thing I would mention is that guidelines are very difficult to fund, because funders often don't want to support something that benefits everyone, which isn't ideal, but it is a challenge in terms of moving forward. So this is an example, and I'll just mention that in the economic evaluation, we've been working with the collaborators who developed CHEERS to think about public involvement reporting in Cheers, the next version, which will be published in January. So there is also increasing interest in how some of these checklists include public involvement reporting within within the actual checklist as well. So Equator have been really significant for us, and I think patient and public involvement is no different in terms of needing to be reported well. So Equator have been great collaborators for us to work with, and I would encourage you to have a look at their website if you haven't already. So where we ended up, having gone through that process of Delphi, the 3-stage Delphi process, we ended up with 5 items that reached agreement that needed to be reported. And I don't think any of these items were in our consensus conference right at the end, where the consensus conference picks up the items that there is still debate to be had about. So the international community agreed on these 5 items. And the first one is aims. So reporting the aims of what you're doing in a study, and that can be the aims within the study itself, but also the aims of the public involvement, just to create a sort of a consistency of people's ambition behind their public involvement. And then the second one, you won't be surprised, was methods. So provide a clear description of the methods used for public involvement in the study. And you probably remember me mentioning that that was a particularly problematical area for our systematic reviews, where the vagueness and the sometimes the lack of reporting about what people did meant that we often couldn't evaluate the study in any way. We just couldn't see what they'd done. The description was just too poor. So the actual public involvement approach, the methods, really, really important. And that could be, you know, setting up a group, describing the people in the group, what they did, how it worked, how they inputted. So this can be very flexible. That's the thing I would say about these items. They are purposefully broad to allow people to report what they need to and not too prescriptive, so that they are directing reporting in a way that's not helpful to the community. And then the third item is results. So the outcomes of a study. So what did you find? What did the public involvement, what was the outcome of the public involvement? And that was particularly both the positive and the negative outcomes. And you probably remember me saying in the published literature, there was much less about the negative outcomes and negative impacts. And we know that is really, really important for us to achieve. And then the fourth item was the outcomes in terms of a discussion. So we found that the location of information about public involvement in a paper was very variable. And I think we wanted people to say something about what they'd done in their discussion section of a paper, because that often wasn't the case previously. So encouraging people to comment on what they'd done, the extent to which public involvement had influenced their study overall, the positive and the negative, just to say, to make sure that's included as part of the discussion section was really, really important. And then the final grip to short form is reflection. So the critical perspective, and this was something again that you will remember I mentioned, that it was quite hard for people to critique what they had done, or it was rarer for people to say, you know, in hindsight, we would have done it this way because of this problem. Or you know, our contributors or our researchers had a bad experience. That was quite rare. And I think, you know, even though that can be difficult to report, it's vital that those sorts of experiences are captured, but also the broader critical evaluation of, you know, we use this approach and actually it wasn't so great. And again, if we were doing this from the beginning, we would change it in these ways. So you're making it life easier for the next person coming along in terms of what you did, how it worked, and whether you think it's a good idea next time. And again, that's really important. So this is what we ended up with in terms of 5 items. And I think with our collaborators, we felt that these items sort of represented the core of the reporting and were broad enough that they allow the flexibility of people to tell us what they've done in the ways they have, but they're not and they're not too prescriptive in terms of the real specifics of a project. So just to give you an example, we published GRIP2 in research involvement and engagement, and also in the BMJ, and I'll just show you what they look like, and our collaborators there. So Joe Brett worked on this, Niveta Simera from Equator, Kate Sears and Carol Mockford, who Joe and Carol had done the 2 reviews, Susan Goodlad, who did a great job of running the Delphi, actually, really important part of it, and then Doug Altman, who is sadly no longer with us, but has been absolutely instrumental in Equator and in the broader sort of evidence-based healthcare movement, David Moa, Rosemary Barber, Simon Denegri, and then Andrew Entwistle, who was a public contributor, Peter Littlejohns from NICE, Chris Morris, Rashida Suleiman, who is a public contributor, Victoria Thomas from NICE, and Colin Seisel, who was a public contributor. So they all contributed to all aspects of the study, and we were really, really pleased to work with them all. And then, as is the case with a lot of guidance like this, it was published simultaneously in the BMJ, who led on the peer review process. Again, exactly the same paper, but published in a journal that was accessing a slightly different group from our research involvement and engagement, with the ambition that we were sort of pushing this at the sort of clinical, the medical community, to get them to start thinking about how they're reporting their public involvement. Okay, so this is a very dense slide. I'm not going to go through it, but this is just an example, so you can see how we used GRIP2 to report the public involvement in the development of GRIP2. So we reported on the aims of the study. We tried to give an account of the methods and what we did in terms of the input into the process and into the Delphi. We then looked at the outcomes in terms of the results in terms of outcomes, and where public contributors had an impact around collating initial evidence, identifying items for the GRIP checklist, considering the evidence and their wider experience. There was a lot of discussion about items and which items were relevant. They had a really important role in recruiting nearly half of the participants in the Delphi in terms of through their networks, through their patient organisations. And also they did help us with, did help people with some of the technical aspects of completing the survey through those networks where they found people. So you can see that we were trying to be as comprehensive as we could without providing a really long description of what we did. And I think the flexibility of GRIP2 is that you can either publish it in this way or report it in this way as a one side of A4 or less, or you can take these elements and blend them into the paper itself. You can have areas where you can report on these different factors. So you can see there at the end that the discussion section, we tried to pick up on things like limitations. We considered the broader outcomes of the study, and I think some of the contextual things, the things that made the development of GRIP2 work from a PPI perspective. So you can see that this is a flexible approach. We're not being prescriptive about what each of these elements includes, and it does give you that flexibility of reporting the sorts of things that you want to report and need to report about your study. So where we've got to with GRIP2, I guess is a reflection of the sort of way it's been used, some of the feedback we've had, but also this reflection of, all reporting guidance evolves. So we've seen that with guidance like Consort for trials, that over time it changes, it metamorphosizes, new items get added. And we've started exploring, and as have others, how GRIP2 should change in the future. I know Julia Jones and colleagues have started thinking about that. And I was approached this week by someone who is collating evidence of where GRIP's been used and had found nearly 400 examples. So we're hoping to link up with them and find out more about what they are doing, because that's really important. So the plan we have is to ideally secure funding, bearing in mind what I said earlier about the challenges of funding guidance, to review GRIP2 and identify potentially new candidate items. But as we've said, moreover, we do recognise that GRIP2 sits in this academic context, and that's really important, but we need to think about other aspects. And I think this concept of moving beyond that within the reporting world is one that is brand new. So the Equator website I showed you earlier, that is all academically driven guidance for reporting. It is not patient and public derived, if you like. It's a very much academic endeavour. So I think what we're seeing is that while these academic concepts are important and they're important drivers of the evidence base, the world of reporting is needing, I think, a step change in how we think about patient important reporting. A really, really vital area of thinking for us. So we've done some early work using some internal funding at Warwick, exploring what patients and public contributors would like to report about their involvement. And we did that before the pandemic and had a fantastic day with about 40 public contributors, where we tried to explore what the new world of patient important reporting might look like, and what do patients want reported about their involvement. And it's clear that they did want a role. Certainly the people who were working with us did want a role in the reporting, but the early signals were very much that concepts of importance are different from the academic way of thinking about reporting. And we started on that journey, I think, that day, where we started thinking about what that would look like. So I think it's probably the first time anyone's done that with a formal Equator developed reporting guideline, but really vital for our thinking. So at this point, Richard, who has been very quiet, not usual for him, handing over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and quite possibly good night, vast global audience. I have one slide to show you, and you can see what it says. It's following the theme that Sophie's just introduced, and in fact, which has been developing in chat as well, which is about letting the people speak. And I'm coming at this from two different angles. One is that we all believe that in patient involvement and engagement, because patients, members of the public, bring a different perspective. So maybe that different perspective also needs capturing in the reporting of their involvement, but also because of some of the things that have been raised in chat. Sometimes things didn't work for us as well as they might have done for the researchers, and as well as they might have done, or as well as the researchers think they did, for us. So there's this issue of how do we make our views known? And I'm not sure whether we need a separate form or we just need to do more work with GRIP. So the logic I've set out on the slide: PPI partners are part of the research, therefore they should be helping to report the research itself, and they should also be helping to look at their own part in the process, the value that they added. And I do prefer that phrase, adding value, or perhaps having influence, rather than using words like impact, which can so often be a bad thing, like a car crash. So does GRIP2 actually capture the patient perspective of how we add value? And where it has been used by studies where things worked out well, yes, it has. But actually, as you've just seen from the figures, many researchers on this call haven't yet used it. And those who have, it was only a minority who actually used it with patients. So presumably people sat down with patients and worked their way through it, or worked their way through parts of it. And I suspect that's probably in the short form rather than the long form, but that's just a suspicion. And I do wonder, 77% of people who responded in chat said patients should have their own reporting tool, and I'm just wondering why that is. Is it because it's better to avoid potential clashes? Is it because academics want to get on with their own work? Or is it because there is value in actually having that separate perspective? And then leading on from that, just how much training and briefing would patients need to be able to do that, given that we often need training to actually get involved with a research study in the first place? So I'm suggesting setting out there that as Sophie and her team look forwards to developing the next stages of GRIP, whatever they may be, in the short term, a plea to more researchers, and share this widely, especially with clinical researchers, which is where most involvement is currently taking place. Help patients, ask them to help you complete GRIP 2, whichever way around it is, but actually complete the GRIP 2 short form and actually see if it does capture the things that they want to report. In the medium term, from that, perhaps we need actually to start developing some specific guidance on how patients might do this and what they want to do, especially if it's patient-authored guidance, of course. And then in the long term, we do need to think about whether or not there is a patient-friendly form of GRIP, a looser GRIP or something like that to develop. And if so, who's going to do that and who's going to fund it? So those are my fairly random thoughts. I would add too that much of that is actually based not only from my own work as a patient who is still involved in various research projects, but also looking at the papers we do publish in the journal Research Involvement and Engagement, where GRIP2 has been used and where we now actually require it with any research papers. But increasingly it's beginning to come in with commentaries as well, which are co-authored by patients. And I would remind people that all of this sets in that wider context where more and more of we patients are wanting to get involved in plain language summaries, are wanting to get involved in the peer review process, and are wanting to be authors and co-authors of papers. It's our health. We are the ones volunteering to participate in the research, and actually we want more of an influence in delivering the research. We're the ones often funding the research, and we're now looking at more involvement in guiding and steering the research. So let's have a bit more involvement in reporting our involvement. Thanks a lot. Back to Sophie.
Thanks, Richard. Really helpfully captured the issues that, collectively I think we're starting to think about, and as a community as well. And it's really interesting hearing your perspectives on what those next steps could be, and having a patient version would be really interesting. I think it also raises the question more broadly of reporting and patient versions of the sorts of reporting that is commonly done. So the sorts of things I've shown you, the Consort and the Prisma guidance, how do we push forward on reporting in other areas of health research as well? So it does raise lots of questions, but that's a really interesting perspective. Okay, so we are very interested not only in your thoughts today, but we want to hear from you in terms of your experiences, your perspectives. So please do email me, and we are starting to think about what our next steps could look like in terms of GRIP. And also more broadly, how do we build this strong evidence base for public involvement? It might not be just reporting, it could be other things. So please do get in touch. We'd really like to hear from you in terms of what we might do next. So I've just put this slide up, I know, which is a very researcher thing to do, but really just to acknowledge and thank all of the people who've contributed to GRIP2 thinking and development. And you can see here the studies that we've published, including the 2 GRIP papers. We also have a very long methods paper, which Joe led on, that reported the methods for consensus development. And then we have the systematic reviews and the original GRIP checklist. So please do get in touch if you have any problems tracking those papers down. Very happy to share those. And that's my contact. So at that point, I will stop and hand back to Richard.